version prior. I didn't want to cause any issues before my demo. So here we go, just a very basic application. We can type in something like, see what's happening on CNN. It's going to go to the server. Might take a little bit because of the network connection. There we go. Sure enough, we can see we've got a lot of tweets. We can see the username, what their real name is. We can see what client they use. We can see the actual tweet. But it looks like there's a big hole right here where there should be a profile image. So that seems to be a valid bug that we're going to have to address. Well, just out of curiosity, where would be the first place some of you would go to start solving this problem? Okay. The first thing I'm going to do in this case, and those are all, that's where we're going to get to. The first thing I'm going to check out is I'm going to use the network monitor to be sure that we know what we're getting from the server. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this application. I'm going to go back here into Flash Builder. I'm going to highlight my application, which is called Twitter Search, and then I'm going to go to the Network Monitor tab. And I'm going to make it a tad bit bigger here. And one of the things I'm going to do, you can see here it says recording, is this is actually already enabled for my application. But if it weren't, I'll go ahead and disable it just real quick. This would be the icon you'd see, and this is the icon you click to enable it for your project. You have to enable it per project. There's a couple caveats I'll give with this. You want to be sure that when you actually deploy your application to a server, that you use the release build function within Flash Builder. If you were to just take the debug Swift, because of the integration it now has with Network Monitor, it won't work anywhere else. So you have to be sure that if you're really, if you're building an app and you're deploying it, you use the release build functionality, because Network Monitor will break it when you try to take it outside of Flash Builder. So I'm going to go ahead and enable it. I'm going to enable Network Monitor. I'm going to go ahead and fire back up the application. I'm going to debug it. It's going to pop up on the screen. I'm going to do the exact same search again. Again, we want to have something that's predictable. We knew it didn't work when we searched for CNN, so we'll search for CNN again. It's going to come back up. Again, fair warning, this is like really searching Twitter, so I have no control over what comes up. I don't think we should have any problems. I'm searching for very vague and safe search terms. But if we go back here and look, we can see that there is one entry under the Network Monitor. In this case, and I'll actually bring this up here, we called an HTTP service that reached out to search.twitter.com and then used the Atom search with the query of CNN. We can actually go in and look very specifically at the request and the response. We can see here that we did send a parameter, it was CNN as we expected. The response that we got back, we can look at the response body. In this case it's XML, so we might get a bit more out of it by going into the raw view. So we actually can, instead of looking at this type of view, we can just go in and look at the raw data. We can see here we have all the HTTP headers, and then we have the XML. So I'm just going to highlight all this. It's not extremely easy to read right here, but that's okay. We'll just do a quick, I could actually drop this into another file. Just to save time, I'm going to drop this into TextMate, but it would work with doing it directly in Eclipse as well. I'm just going to tidy this up real quick. And what we can do is we can see here that for a single entry, so this is a single tweet, we do have a link right here that actually does have a URL coming back for the profile image. If I wanted to, I could even copy this, and if I were to go into my browser, this would actually go to a valid image. Just trust me on that. I've tested this. It really is an image. So the problem is somewhere in our code. We verified that the server is giving us the right data. We're just not doing something right with it. Now, this is a bit of a concern, because the way that we have built this application, we have a delegate that actually goes to the server. It says, okay, let me do an HTTP service to get all this data. It brings back in the XML, and then we have a translator that translates this XML into objects, like into VOs. And really just basic objects with no functionality in them, but just that match the properties that are in that XML. So if I go look at twitterentry.as, we can see that in this Twitter entry, we have a profile image URL, and it's a string. And that's what's going to actually power our item renderer that I'll show you in a bit. But now I have some concern. Okay, so I get this from a client, something doesn't work. What's my fear here? That could be an issue, but if one thing doesn't work, is it possible there are other bugs in this translator as well? No. Probably. At that point I wouldn't say maybe, I would say probably. So here's a great instance, if you haven't done any unit testing, this is the easiest area to understand how to work with unit testing. So we know very specifically that if we get a certain piece of XML that says, this is the tweet, this is the author, this is the profile image, and goes down through the list, we know exactly what that should look like as an object. Okay? We know that it should just match up with these properties. So if the profile image URL in the XML was that URL we saw, then it should be exactly the same after we translate it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to write a unit test to test this whole process of translating the XML into objects. So, how many of you, will this be your first unit test? Oh, go ahead.
Quick question. The network monitor, that's in Flash Builder 4, not Burrito, or is it in Burrito?
It's in Burrito as well.
But I mean, it's in Flash Builder 4?
Yes.
Currently? Oh,
yes, yes.
Cool.
This is not a brand new feature. Yeah, it's only in Pro. And here's just another note. I'm going to throw this out here. I know some of you have Flash Builder if you got like CS4, CS5. You need to get Pro if you're going to be doing serious Flex development. And that kind of stinks if you're used to using the one that's not Pro. But there's a lot of tools that you're going to need that are only in Pro. So I'll just throw that out there. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that it will do here as well is if you have AMF3 data. So if you're doing remoting with like Java, Cold Fusion, PHP, whatever, it also will decode all your AMF data, and you can see it just as objects in here as well. So it's a very handy tool. So, I asked this and I answered another question, but how many of you will this be the first unit test you've ever written that we're getting ready to write right here? Good stuff. So here's the way we're going to do it. Here's the class we're going to test. It's called Twitter Search Translator. And we'll get into some other issues that we have with this class in a little bit later. But we can see here that it actually translates the Twitter Search XML and then returns a Twitter Search object. And then there's several child objects that it also does. So here's the entry. And then we have, in addition to the entry, we have the Twitter author. And there's kind of a utility method that separates out the username and the real name. And this is the class we want to test. We want to be sure it works exactly as expected. So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go to New. And there's some options that were introduced in Flash Builder 4, New Test Case Class and Test Suite Class. So I'm going to go ahead and click New Test Case Class. And in this case, it's done a great job of saying, because I highlighted this when I right-clicked, it knows that this is the class that I want to test. It already has the information in there. It's got everything set up for me. It already uses best practices of using the class name and then appending test to the end, so I know that this is a unit test. And it's even got the correct, well, it's just correctly set up. I'm using Flex Unit 4. If you're getting started, you need to use Flex Unit 4. Only if you have some kind of old legacy stuff you're still trying to support, should you still use Flex Unit 1. It still works, but Flex Unit 4 is what you need to be using. Then you get to say, which methods are we going to test? Well, I'm going to test everything in the Twitter Search Translator, but I'm not going to test the constructor because there's no logic in there. So at this point, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to hit Finish. Now one small caveat I will give, I prefer to keep all of my tests in a separate source path. And thankfully, with the way it works in Flash Builder 4, I actually can just drag this down. I already have a source path set up called test. I already have a package ready for it. It actually went through, luckily this is the same package name, but even if it weren't, it would have done that refactoring for me already. That's something that was integrated in Flash Builder 4. So here's a test. Now again, this isn't a class specifically on unit testing, so I'm not going to be able to go through every detail with you, but we're going to write a unit test, and by write I mean copy and paste, and I'm going to explain to you what's there. So what we have here, and I'm going to scroll up to the top, is we have some XML that I've pulled directly from this Twitter service. And so in this specific piece of XML, we have multiple entries, and this works exactly just like I was pulling it from the server. And I've also kind of separated this out down here into smaller chunks that we can use specifically for testing. And again, the great thing is here, as with any test, you have to have two things. You have to have an assumption, and then you have to write something that tests your assumption. So what we're doing here is we're saying we know exactly what the XML is going to be, because we're just using XML we grabbed from Twitter for our test. And then we're saying we know that we should be able to match this to the value within the objects after we translate it. So just to show you some quick logic, we know that when we translate a Twitter entry, we're going to get an entry back. And then we know that the ID of the entry should be equal to that text. And you see that there around line 150. So you see this right here. We know what the ID is because that's in the XML, and we're asserting that these two things are equal. And this is the core concept of a unit test. Your assumption is that this should be equal to this. You test